welcome to another episode of Bro History at Henry Zamota and Danny Abdel-Jabbar, and also our good friend Jose Niño. Jose Niño has a podcast called El Niño Speaks, and Jose and myself actually have kind of like a side show called America's Second, which Jose hosts on his Substack, which I would encourage you to listen to. But today he's joining Bro History. So, Jose, thanks for taking time to speak with us.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, Henry. And I always enjoy these conversations with you and Danny.
Yeah, man, I appreciate it. Well, let's talk about the subject at hand. So, our good friend and mentor, Bashar al-Assad, has
Come on.
has retired. He has decided to quit the life of being a head of state, an executive of the Ba'ath Party in Syria, and he has decided to open up a medical practice. So going back to his roots as an eye doctor, which he will establish in Moscow. And just wanted to get your take on this, Jose. Let me just leave with a preface. I'm joking, obviously, but I've been listening to a lot of different things online and different podcasts, and I've been reading a lot of things, and I don't really think anyone has a good grasp of the situation right now. Mm-hmm. So, including myself, but I think I have a basic idea. But what is your initial take on why Syria fell so quickly? I'll start off with that question.
Well, I think, in my opinion, Syria is always somewhat of a powder keg. If you just look at its confessional and ethnic makeup, you just have in the Assad family, like this quasi-family dynasty that's an Alawite minority lording over a state that is predominantly Sunni Arab, and then you have like the Kurdish issue and all of that, and the fact that it's also on the U.S. and like Israel's like most wanted list of countries just topple makes it the situation there always like politically tense. And I think even with the initially successful intervention that Russia and its PMCs and Wagner and Hezbollah's intervention during the Arab Spring that propped up the Assad government, even when you had that happen, I always had the impression that the country was always like teetering on the edge of like some type of uprising or a collapse even. And you add that the sanctions, the overall like isolation from like most of the international community, especially the West, you have like a really tenuous situation for like Syria, especially like Assad, to maintain control. And even with like the victories that the Assad government had, that whole Astana process that started like in 2017, 2018 was at best like freezing a conflict that was going to just pop off 5 to like 10 years further down the line. And also like the US occupation of the areas where there's a lot of oil and like wheat as well, coupled with crippling sanctions, just made it damn near impossible for Syria to get back on its feet, especially when it comes to paying like generals and troops. Where if you just look at like Alistair Crook was pointing this out, that a lot of Syrian generals were barely making like $40 a month. Contrast that to the Renta jihadists that were fighting for HTS and assorted militants. They're making like $2K a month, largely because of Gulf Arab money from like Qatar and other foreign sponsors. Just seemed to me that Syria was just hanging by a thread. it also really didn't help matters that a lot of the axis of resistance has been taking a pummeling lately, and that opened up like a new front for the Israeli American axis to strike at Syria. And I think all those factors and the just overall demoralization of like the Syrian state just caused this sudden collapse.
So I think you bring up a lot of really interesting points that I'd love to dive into um, more specifically, because there are some things that I'd like to ask about because I'm not even sure. My trouble with this whole situation was that I felt like it came out of left field. I mean, Henry and I, we haven't talked about Syria on this show in years. I feel like, for a while, it just kind of felt like, oh, Assad won that civil war. That's it. Like, were they perfect? No. So I think it would be helpful for the listeners here for us to just give a quick rundown of that civil war from 2011 to now. And I put together some brief bullet points on this one, and y'all please jump in if you think I'm getting something wrong here. But I think it's just helpful to set that framework for folks who haven't even thought about this, like myself, in a couple of years. So I have 2011 in March. There's anti-government protests that start in Dera. That's obviously inspired by the Arab Spring. Syrian security forces they respond to the violence, and there's like this ignition of nationwide unrest. And then in July, there's the formulation of the Free Syrian Army, the FSA, and that's composed of a bunch of defectors from the Syrian military and also a hodgepodge of probably terrorist groups. That one's got a lot of baggage behind it, but that's what happened in July of 2011. In 2012 and 2013, there's just like giant escalation of international involvement. There's battles that spread to Aleppo and Damascus, and it becomes like increasingly sectarian in that period. Hezbollah in 2012 also then openly backs the Assad regime, while a bunch of opposition groups start getting support from, as you said, Jose, the Gulf states and of course Western powers. And then in August of 2013, there was that chemical attack in Ghouta that killed like hundreds of people, which really sparked that international outrage. And the U.S. Started negotiating for the removal of Assad's, declared chemical weapon stockpile. Then in 2014 to 2015, so this is when ISIS pops up, and also when Russia starts to intervene. So ISIS declares a caliphate in 2014. After they seized a pretty sizable territory in Syria and Iraq, which included Raqqa, which was their de facto capital. And then in September of 2014, the U.S. leads this coalition to launch a bunch of airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. 2015, Russia steps in. They intervene militarily to support the Assad regime. They shift the war's dynamics to the regime's favor. But I don't think without this help that Syria would have been a Syria at this point in time. I don't think anyone would deny that. 2016 to 2017, there's again a lot of battles and regional tensions. So in December of 2016, Aleppo falls, which was a huge turning point in Assad's favor. In April of 2017, there was a chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun that kills dozens, and then the U.S. does a missile strike on a Syrian airbase in response. 2018 to 2019, consolidation of this like regional control. So Assad regains a lot of the control of eastern Ghouta and Dara, which effectively crushes the major rebel strongholds that were present at the time. October 2019, Turkey launches an offensive in northern Syria. They target specifically the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces after the U.S. is basically announcing a troop withdrawal. And then there's this like really quiet period, right? So in 2020, there's a ceasefire in Idlib that's brokered by Turkey and Russia. And this basically stabilizes the front lines, and it left HTS in control of much of Idlib province. And then between 2022 and 2023, pretty much nothing militarily happens. Syria, of course, starts facing worsening economic collapse, and that's driven by a number of factors. And I think we can't ignore also, the global pandemic during that period that happened pretty much everywhere. So at that time, this is around when Henry and I think, stopped paying attention to Syria.
Yeah.
You know,
So what happened with, just to give context within the Idlib, it's important. So what their strategy was is that they took a lot of these Islamists, and they bust them up to Idlib. So that was their solution. So they're like, hey, you can either die in an airstrike by Russia, or you can take this bus and you can go to Idlib. And that was their strategy, and that's how so many of these jihadists ended up in northern Syria. They were literally shipped there by Syria and Russia, or bust there by Syria and Russia. But essentially, I mean, that's kind of like the basic framework of like the timeline of the war. Last time we spoke about it, the conversation really was, is the Syrian army going to lead that assault on Idlib? And it seemed like it could have happened at some point, but it didn't seem that feasible. It didn't, in hindsight, obviously didn't seem feasible, but at least at that point there was like much higher morale in the army. Between 2019 really and now, so over a 5-year period, like Jose said, the sanctions have really rotted the country. But also, Syria is an authoritarian state, and they have a lot of, essentially the dynamic that Jose pointed out earlier. I mean, you have the Alawite, you have a minority. I think it's important to put this framework out. So the composition of Syria, so basically it's ran by a coalition of minorities, which include the Alawites, which is Assad's faction. The Alawites are kind of like, the billionaire class. Assad's cousin is like worth $5 billion and controls like a lot of the state industries. Then you have the Christians, then you have the Shia, and then Druze. So these minority factions are essentially the ones in power, or have been in power. And then the Sunnis, about 70-75% of the country is Sunni. They were the ones, quote unquote, as the opposition. But it's a lot more complex than that, because there's a lot of the majority of the Syrian army was actually indeed Sunni. So it comes down to like what patron network that you were in. The history of Syria, even before the current crisis, there has always been bloody conflict between the secular government, between the Assad regime, Assad's father, and the Muslim Brotherhood groups. There's been brutal sieges of fighting between the secular government and Muslim Brotherhood groups. So the struggle between jihadists and the Syrian government has been a decades-long struggle, really ever since the inception of the state itself. And also, just in context, like Syria was highly unstable prior to the Assad regime taking power. Like, I think Assad's father was like the third coup in like a period of like 3 years or so. It was like a time. It was essentially, he took power after the failed attempt to unite the Nasser's unification process of uniting Syria, Iraq, and Egypt into one state. It kind of happened in the years following that, because all those countries were complete basket cases at the time. I mean, Syria, all these countries are still basket cases, but yeah, it's quite crazy. But again, it's not that surprising that the state collapsed under the pressure of the entire West, because you have to remember that Syria was an ally with the United States during the Gulf War, we worked with them. They used to torture our prisoners.
Yeah, that was extraordinary rendition.
Yeah, they used to torture our prisoners. So it's a weird thing, but it shouldn't be that surprising. I guess the question is, now, knowing that there's been this history of sectarian fighting, and very brutal sectarian fighting. So the conflict in Syria is akin to the 30-year war, in my opinion. Like, it's very, and this extends to the Iraqi civil war as well. Like, those wars were like the religious wars of the 17th century in Europe. Just like very brutal, very like kind of uh, mean spirited, with lots of massacres. I mean, when I say mean spirited, I mean that's like a light term to saying like just blatant massacres. This is where we're finding, the postal service, or all the employees from the postal service being thrown out off the roof of the building. Like, yeah, they're government workers, but they're postal workers, and you're executing them by throwing them off the building. Those were the types of atrocities that these rebels were pulling off. In addition to chopping people's heads off, and then there's the cases of them eating people's hearts and stuff. I forget which group it was. That it was like one of the groups that we declared as moderate. They took a guy,
al-Nusra
they
front,
ripped
I
his
think?
heart off. I think I don't think it was al-Nusra. It was one that we put as moderate, or moderate label on. They ate somebody's heart, like they kind of like some Indiana Jones type shit. Like Kalima, and they pulled his heart off, and you all get the visual. But yeah, I mean, it was a brutal war, lots of massacres, ethnic minorities were killed. Assad fought back in a brutal fashion as well, indiscriminately bombing civilian areas. So the whole situation was a mess. Now, Jose, in your opinion, do you think that with this new government and the Assad regime gone, that the war will spiral, like, this type of sectarian violence or ethnic violence will spiral out of control again?
Yeah, I don't think that this is going to be a clean regime change. You're going to see some really weird stuff pop off, maybe even like partitions, because you've got the Turkish equation, and then the 10,000 pound elephant in the living room of Israel just coming in and saying, hey, we're establishing a buffer zone, a temporary defensive position, if you will. I think that we're entering another phase. The civil war is not over. I think there's going to be, and I don't think it's going to break down, as you mentioned, on just like Sunni unification. You might see a lot of factional infighting between some more like really nasty jihadist types, and then Muslim Brotherhood types as well, because the Muslim Brotherhood, in terms of like Islamist movements, they tend to be the more optical types. They will use democratic features and Western forms of like liberal governance to impose like Islamic values, and they're not as hands on when it comes to carrying out gross acts of terror or like partisan violence. But I think there's going to be some type of um factional infighting, and that we're entering a different stage of this conflict. So to put a bookmark in the Civil War is a bit too hasty at the moment.
I think I kind of agree with you, Jose. It's important to kind of see like how the international community is seeing this. There's definitely a cautious optimism right now, at least that I'm reading, regarding Syria's future from these like state medias. The U.S. emphasized that we obviously need to secure chemical weapons to prevent their misuse, but and the United Nations was calling for a political, like an inclusive political transition, whatever the hell that means. But if you look at the HTS
It
leader,
means don't
Abu,
kill it means don't kill all the Christians and Alawites. That's
yeah,
what it means. It means
exactly,
like don't go on revenge killing tours, because
right.
it's really bad timing.
Well, you just have to look at the folks who won this current battle. If we're not calling it the end of the war, like HTS, deposed the Assad regime and their leader Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, which I think I forget which is his real name. I think it's Ahmed al-Shara, or the other way around. I forget. This guy, he started initiating some discussions with the outgoing prime minister of Syria, so Mohammed Ghazi Jalali, I think that's his name. And they're working with them to transition to coordinate a transfer of power. Apparently, what their setup is an interim government that's led by Mohammed al-Bashir, and it's basically established to manage the country during a 3-month transitional period that starts, I think, in January and ends early March 2025. So I mean, they have a plan, right? It's not as though like the caliphate took over, and it's just going to be like blood in the streets everywhere. At least it does feel more, I don't know, organized than prior attempts.
Well, to your point, Danny, I will say this. I think that there's going to be a huge effort to keep the violence from spilling out.
Hmm.
I mean, if you just look, I mean, Jelani is was part of Al Qaeda.
Yeah, I mean,
Jelani has a 10 million.
HTS is an Al Qaeda offshoot. It's an Al Qaeda
Well,
in Syria offshoot.
Jelani specifically is one of the worst criminals on earth.
Yeah.
If you follow his career, like he's responsible for some of the worst massacres. He's responsible for some of the worst kind of persecutions of minorities.
Hmm.
He's
Well, I mean, notably,
responsible.
he's not taking power, right? Like the guy who's going to be in charge is Mohammed al-Bashir, who I don't know a whole lot about. But it's interesting that the guy who led the forces into the battle to depose Assad isn't saying, "Oh, I'm the king now." That's
Well,
interesting to me.
what's interesting to me is the sanitation of him. Like you don't really hear that much because right now he's a wanted terrorist.
Hmm.
There is a $10 million bounty from the U.S. State Department on his head.
Mm.
This isn't like, oh, this guy has like, a kind of a shady like this guy is like a criminal killer
Hmm.
responsible of horrible atrocities, suicide bombings, massacres. Like this is a real terrorist. What's interesting is that they had him slapped up in the same get up as Zelensky. Like, have you seen that?
Yes,
I
Dude,
didn't
yeah,
see
it's
that. Let me
funny,
Google that.
dude,
it's
Hold on.
dude,
funny.
he
Yeah,
has the same uniform as Zelensky. Like the
Like
exact
the
same
green
thing.
T-shirt and the camo pants or
Yeah, the
whatever.
green t-shirt and camo, and like he even kind of looks like Zelensky a little bit, and
yeah.
Oh
it's
man,
it's
I'm seeing it. Yeah.
so
Yeah,
they
I was
put him through
joking
some type of
saying
PR
he's Al
shit,
Zelensky.
and they're branding him as like a reform. Like, okay, yeah, he's been a bad guy, but like people can change. The guys can change. That's how he's being branded right now. Um, I don't know if he's going to be the strong. I doubt he'll be the strong man in Syria. I think there's too much baggage there. But it is quite the effort to rehabilitate him has been disturbing to say the least. What are your thoughts on
Yeah.
that, Jose?
Yes, what I found interesting about these rebels, in contrast to other like Islamists, they were much more marketing savvy in terms of like the media tours they would do, and like they would use a lot of like language of like diversity and inclusion
the
to
the
justify.
DEI rebels.
Yeah, they were using that a lot more as opposed to like previous generations. Like you would have like blatantly anti-Western, but a lot of that's also for PR to make their otherwise like pretty like nasty agenda more palatable. But it seems that these guys have gotten a bit savvier with their talking points to try to build some degree of like legitimacy abroad and appeal to Western audiences.
Well, do you remember? So during the war, there was this guy from the U.S. He was from Harlem. His name is Bilal Abdul Karim, and he was from Harlem and he moved to Syria and he joined HTS essentially. He became like a PR guy for HTS. And he was actually put on the US kill list. So the
Hmm.
US tried to kill him like 5 or 6 times. And he had this YouTube channel where he would try he would basically do PR for HTS, but he was like the journalism he was doing was actually pretty good. Like he would do like up to date like battlefield updates. Um he would talk about all the infighting that would happen between the different like Islamist groups. Like he would be like, "Oh, there's been like he'd interview different leaders of HTS or other groups, and they would talk about like these terrible betrayals from other ones, and it would happen all the time. And this guy was eventually arrested by HTS, and I don't know what happened to him. I think he was released, and he's still living to this day. But these groups in themselves can break off and start fighting each other really easily. You know, there's those reports of like CIA-backed groups fighting like Pentagon-backed groups.
Yeah.
Like it's a total shit show. Like these guys are, you know, they're basically fucking, you know, just they're total brutes. You know, they can factionalize really quickly and start fighting. The question is like how many of these guys are actually in the country right now? I imagine a lot, just by the amount of foreigners there seems to be. Like there's a lot of Chechen guys, a lot of fucking I saw a lot of Uyghurs,
Yeah,
like
Uyghurs,
a lot of Asian guys decked out in like the new Syria, Chechens and Uyghurs and people from, you know, Dagestan and whatever.
hitting that diversity quota.
Yeah, yeah, that's what they mean by diversity. Like, yeah, Chechens, you know, Sunni worshippers of Muhammad from the Caucasus and Central Asia and the Arab world can all live under the same place as long as you do that. But I don't think they're going to get the same money that they that they've got before.
Well,
to even really
actually
pull
have
off an
something.
occupation force.
Yeah, I actually think I agree with you, Henry. I think that's very easy for this group to like infight, especially given some of the things that you pointed out. You know, by that guy from Harlem who, you know, reported on a lot of that. But yeah, I keep coming back to this. How did this happen so quickly? And I just started doing a little bit of research, and HTS is actually a lot more functional than than you would think.
Yeah,
And I
they're the
think
government of Idlib. Like they're I mean they've been the government of Idlib and they've been getting funding from Turkey. So like it's not
it's
they're kind of like Hezbollah.
it's not just external funding either. I mean, they totally
Yeah.
controlled the local economy, right? So that includes the financial services, oil and gas, telecommunications, and just generating a shit ton of revenue on their own for years now. They also do border control, so they held the key border crossing at Bab al Hawa with Turkey, and they facilitated trade and taxation on there. And I just learned this; I had no idea. They have in-house arms production. They
Yeah.
have been developing their own weapons. They've been producing drones, guided missiles. Like
That's not surprising. That's not surprising. No, that Hezbollah does the same thing. Like eventually they
Well, yeah, but
they
that's
become,
Hezbollah, right? Like like HTS is one of those groups that I was like, I knew about them when we were talking about Syria, and as soon as we stopped talking about Syria, I stopped thinking about them.
just
Hezbollah is
think
the
about it.
largest like non-government like military organization. HTS is small in comparison, but I was very, very surprised to see how well organized they are.
Well, yeah, because they have a state backer too. So they have a state backer in Turkey that fosters them, that there's Turkish intelligence officers that work with them. You know, like it's not like they're just some band. When I'm talking about the infighting, I'm talking about the Islamist because the war in Syria wasn't just HTS. There was many groups that would splinter out. They were all, you know, the majority of them were Islamist, but there are many different factions. HTS became the most powerful one, obviously, but like, there's a lot of splits in the groups too. You know, like and they always rebrand themselves. Like whenever they do something really bad, they do like a rebranding campaign. It's hard to it's really hard to keep track of them to the point where I don't even think it's like really worth it to like, oh well, this group split with that group. I mean, to me, like they're all like Takfiri Salafist who, you know, who obviously have the goal of setting a Sunni supremacist state. Some of them take it a little bit further and they want to, you know, go take that to like a global jihad. But like, you know, just like how you know, just like in the French Revolution where a lot of the, you know, liberals, you know, stepped away from the Jacobins, you know, that it happens in the Islamic world as well, like where, you know, the ones that go too far, you know, people eventually get spooked. But
look, I agree with you. I know that there are many more organizations other than HTS, but if I were to put my money on an organization that's actually going to get it done based on what I know so far, which admittedly is very little, HTS seems like they have a lot of the prerequisites to succeed in holding on to power in Syria.
Yeah, but they're not big enough, man. There's only like 15,000 of them or so. So they can't occupy that country.
I'm with you. They're going to need to bring in more people, right? But if they're able to, at least in this interim government that they're trying to set up, if they're able to make even moderate amounts of change that is positive for not only just themselves, but for literally Syria in general, I guarantee you that a lot of groups fall in line. It comes down to whether or not they can actually execute on their plan.
It won't be a matter of them executing on a plan. It'd be a matter of them being appealing enough to foreign backers to pump aid into the country, because that's
part of it.
Depend.
That's going to be what. That's not the only thing.
Like the only way to keep this from breaking out into a large scale war. And I texted this to you, Jose, the other day, was that like they're going to have to pump a shitload of aid and just bribe people not to fight. Like they're going to have to bribe these like Sunni militants not to go into Christian neighborhoods and like start putting up like Islamic ISIS type flags. Because if they start doing that, then that's going to break out into.
That's par for the course in Syria in general, because Bashar al-Assad wouldn't have been able to hold shit together had it not been for the Russian intervention and their support, right? So like anyone who sets up camp in the last several decades in Syria needs the external support. And I also go ahead.
Well, I was going to say this segues into something that we should probably talk about.
Sure.
And I didn't mean to interrupt your point, but
I think you're about to say the same thing that I was going to get into anyway, so go for it.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is that now there's a lot of different foreign states that are involved.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, I guess there's two questions that I have. What were the deals that were made in place? Because the Syrian Arab army just did not fight. Like 800 people died in the entire war. You know how many people died in the fucking civil war? 500,000 people.
Yep, 500,000.
800 people died in a blitz take over the city. Syria, they just did not fight. Assad started planning to leave the country when Aleppo fell, or around the time that Aleppo fell. Like once it happened, he already started preparing his evacuation. He essentially said, "I'm checked out, bro. Like there's nothing that can be done," and he
quit.
left. Yeah, like I quit. Like
done skis.
I'm done. Like I'm done. I'm out of it. And you can't really blame him. I mean, he's in his 60s. I think his wife has cancer, or I don't want to say that, but his wife I know is ill. I think he just literally was just tired of dealing with it, dealing with the dictator life. But the point I was trying to make is
you're going into a really good question. Like, okay, how did that happen, right? How does it come about that this group can get away with 800 deaths and topple the Assad regime, whereas the entire civil war claimed 500,000 lives? Like, how does that happen? And then segue into the foreign aid, because I know that there's a lot. Countries are like Turkey and Qatar are denying the fact that they've been supporting this, and then there's also the Israeli angle as well. Israel, over the course of their current conflict, has been randomly bombing or seemingly randomly bombing like key targets in Syria, which didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me then, because I'm like, hey, Hamas is in Gaza, not Syria. But it kind of makes sense now, right? It seems like they saw the writing on the wall and took the opportunity to destabilize one of the what do they call them, axis of resistance, or one of the Iranian proxies or supporters, because Assad and Iran, they were pretty tight, weren't they?
Well, the question is, and Jose, I want your opinion on this. Like, do you think that there were some deals that were made between the Russians and the Iranians and the Turks and even the Israelis about the transfer of power in Syria prior to the fight?
Yeah, I suspect so. I did think that some events to the lead up of this regime change were interesting, like Assad being brought back to the Arab League was an interesting move because some pundits argued that when Syria was brought back to the Arab League, there was an impression that the Assad government was trying to drift away from the so-called axis of resistance from the Iranian orbit. And that apparently sent chills up the spines of people in Tehran, because here's the thing about the foreign intervention in Syria. There was a lot of conflicting goals, end goals especially, because Russia and Iran came to Syria's defense, but they had different reasons for it, and it sometimes it exposed like some degrees of like differing views. For example, Russia was more concerned about maintaining the territorial integrity of Syria and stopping the ISIS threat and the potential for like a transnational Sunni jihadist pipeline to form that would obviously come up on Russia's doorstep, like in Chechnya or whatever.
Also,
Uh,
the port access was important for them too.
Yeah, yes, and actually that's probably part of one of the deals made, because apparently they're still gonna keep that port according to some reports. But Iran, this is where it got interesting, because they weren't just trying to prop up Assad. In many respects, they were trying to build forward bases to just continue tightening up that ring of fire against Israel. And that's why you saw, like, throughout this whole conflict and even before, Israel was launching a lot of strikes against IRGC assets or militia groups connected to Iran. And some people, like, I've seen some Axis of Resistance accounts that were kind of complaining about the fact that the Russians would give air defense to the Syrian government, but they did really nothing about Israel's strikes against um Iranian or Iranian aligned assets in Syria. And it just goes to show that there were like fissures in terms of like the type of support um Assad was getting from some of his ostensive allies. I mean, Syria has been one of like the most consistent allies of Iran since the Islamic Republic was founded. It, like, I think that and Gaddafi's Libya were one of the only two Arab states that backed Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. They've continued to be allies. I do think that as well. You did see that Assad was kind of reticent about giving a lot of aid to like Hezbollah, and even, well, Hamas is actually more obvious why he wouldn't give aid to them during the recent flare up in Israel and Palestine, because of the fact that Hamas is technically part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and in Syria, Hamas at one point was anti-Assad. And that's where these Middle Eastern alliances and things like that get very sticky. But I tend to think that the deals being made were basically that Russia may have like somewhat of a military footprint, like in Tartus for the naval base, for very strategic reasons. And to be honest, Iran might have been on its way out of there, because the moves that Assad was making towards going towards the Gulf states is that, like, hey, we don't want your like state to become like a staging ground for Iran, because they're incredibly skeptical of a Syria that effectively becomes a satrapy of Iran. And in the same token, a lot of these Gulf states, they did have a legitimate interest in keeping Assad propped up, especially the Saudis and Emiratis for the main reason that the Muslim Brotherhood is a really powerful force among the opposition in Syria, and they are the mortal enemies of those two Gulf Arab states and even um, Egypt as well. And they would not like either a Muslim Brotherhood controlled Syria or a fully axis of resistance aligned Syria.
Yeah, I mean before the conflict between Sunnis and Shia, which is like really it's much more of a modern like post like 21st century conflict. The conflict in the Arab world, like what Malcolm Kerr called the Arab Cold War, was between political Islam and then like was like the conflict between like the Muslim Brotherhood and well, actually he talks about more so like Arab nationalism versus monarchies, but also like political Islam being like an enemy to the legitimacy of like the having a king and a prince and the council and stuff like that. So that's like a long that's like a that was like the one of the original points of contention in the Middle East. Um, the rise of political Islam in the 1950s versus like the both secular and royal states. But yeah,
Yeah.
I under it's interesting because it seems here's what I'm reading. This is like a major blow to Iran. This is a major blow to Russia. Yeah, I get it. Like it is kind of, but at the same time, I don't think it's the end of the world for them. I don't think this is like some shattering geopolitical loss that they can't recover
Mm.
from. I think in the case of Iran, it's probably worse that
Yeah,
they've
it's
lost.
definitely much worse for Iran, in my opinion.
I
Mhm.
don't know what they're going to do to arm Hezbollah, but
Right.
I'm
I mean,
sure there's
they literally
ways.
can't access them now, or not via land anymore.
Yeah, Hezbollah. To be honest, they have to tread light because they might get knocked out of the whole game altogether. And I'm going to allude to an article that I published on Substack about like 2 months ago. With them being cut off from Iran, they're very vulnerable not only to a conventional Israeli reprisal. Again, I have a feeling there's a lot of people in Tel Aviv that want like another round that are really emboldened against Hezbollah. But I think they may also, if they fail to beat them conventionally in a conventional military sense, they're going to try to spark a color revolution in Lebanon and possibly engineer like a civil war, a sectarian civil war where Hezbollah just gets chased out of town essentially. They're in a fragile position in my opinion. Iran, I mean, it's anyone's guess because in many respects for the reformers, this is actually kind of good for them because they now have gotten with the so-called axis of resistance on the back foot. They can probably negotiate more with the West for a nuclear deal with the incoming Trump administration. Because one sticking point that a lot of neocon Republicans had about any type of negotiations with Iran had to do with the not just like the nuclear program, but also its malign influence in the Middle East through its proxies and all of that. And with these proxies really weakened, you might see some renewed talks about the resurrection of a nuclear deal in Iran. But at the same time, I just think too the fall of Syria is going to embolden the wackiest elements both in Israel and in the GOP to pursue, I think, a full blown rollback against Iran. They are like zealously committed to that now with Syria out for the count.
Yeah, I think that's more true than the promise or the prospect of rolling out a new nuclear deal. I mean, Trump was the one that pulled out of the JCPOA in the first place, right? I find it highly unlikely that he, you know, decides to renege on that. I think it's probably more likely your second point, his second idea, which is now GOP smells blood in the water, and so do the Israelis.
Yeah.
See, the Israelis are a weird one because while they have a much higher stake in the game, they have bigger interests in dealing hurt to Iran. They also have their hands tied right now, So like
Yeah. It's more likely,
their
I
current
think,
situation
they'll attack
isn't getting better.
Hezbollah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to be more of the opinion because when people ask me about their predictions about what Israel's going to do, I tend to think they're going to go more the greater Israel route, meaning they're going to try to make some gains in Syria and then take out Hezbollah more so than Iran. Iran is a much bigger venture that's gonna have to require their bodyguard in the US to like potentially
Yeah.
handle. That's
Mhm.
I think that's a like tertiary priority for them. But obviously the first priority is Gaza and then Hezbollah. But
It really hasn't seemed that way in the last couple of months. It feels like their first priority now is Lebanon, right? Like I
yeah,
hear a hell of a
yeah,
lot more about, the
yes.
actions in Lebanon than anything in Gaza.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, when I was going back to the nuclear deal thing, I think that's more the initiative is going to be taken more by the reformers in Iran. I think honestly, the Trump administration is just going to ignore those overtures. I think they're going to
Yeah.
be convinced. They are. I think they are utterly convinced that if they just like poke Iran with like a twig, the whole foundation will just collapse. I think that's the talking point that a good deal of Zionist interest groups, the really hawkish ones, are just going to tell the Trump administration, we've got these people on the back foot. The Iranian economy is in shambles. There is a lot of infighting in the Iranian government. This is like the opportune moment to strike. And then the palace intrigue in Iran is another thing to watch out for too, because the reformist government, I'm seeing a lot on Twitter. It's not just getting criticisms from like everyday Iranians, but from the more like hardliners too, which could spark a really big debate like of Iran potentially going nuclear. Because one thing to note, the axis of resistance, the ring of fire, and the Shiite crescent strategy of Iran was like a form of like deterrence that it was able to establish against Israel and Sunni states too, that almost functioned as like a WMD. And with that weakened, you're going to see some really strong calls for Iran potentially going nuclear. And it's going to be very intriguing to see how things unfold in the next year, because domestically and internationally, Iran does find itself in a very weird position.
So going the North Korea route there, basically, right?
I mean, that's what it. I'm hearing a lot more talks when I go on like the Iranian Twitter or a lot of the geopolitical Twitter that deal with Iran, that it's starting to become a elite talking point now in Iran. There is a slow consensus emerging on that issue.
Yeah, that's what Mearsheimer's been saying for years, that the harder that the US is on Iran, the more likely they are to go for the nuke. And I guess the question is like, if they start, because their level for them to get a nuclear bomb, I forget what the timetable
90,
is.
90. Well, next month, according to
There's the
Bibi
propaganda
Netanyahu.
number that
Yeah.
Netanyahu says, but like now the actual rate is like faster, it's quicker than the propaganda number.
Yeah, I mean,
Netanyahu
there's
used to
telltale
say.
signs of that,
There's
though,
like a couple
right?
of weeks they would be able to enrich it to the point,
Yeah,
enrich their uranium.
there'd be telltale signs of that, and I don't think that would be left unnoticed or unchecked.
No, I don't think it definitely wouldn't go unnoticed, but it depends on, like, if Iran starts to um build a nuclear weapon, like, can they do it in a place in the mountains where it would be immune to U.S. strikes? Because I think there's no way the United States wouldn't initiate an airstrike against it. Like,
Yeah, of course, that's what I was going to suggest. But I think like there's logistical supply chains and things that are like precursors to, oh, they're ramping up their production, that not only the U.S. would notice, but so would the Israelis, and so would all the other people who are antagonistic towards Iran. I don't think that yeah, you could probably build like a silo somewhere in the middle of the mountains to make it hardened and stuff like that. But that all just adds time to the turnaround time frame, and they would notice the types of materials and acquisitions and infrastructure movements that would be dead giveaways to the fact that they're trying to enrich to nuclear capacity. Their regular nuclear facilities would be bombed to smithereens if we notice them.
yeah, I mean, I would say the majority of Republicans right now would want that to happen.
Sure. And
Yes.
with
I
an
mean, in
incoming
government.
Republican, trifecta, it's very well possible that could be pushed through as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
easily. Yes.
I think I
Yeah.
think that's a big possibility. I mean, that's going to be the question, like the big geopolitical conversation, because as the Ukraine war kind of wraps up, which it feels like it is wrapping up at this point, but who knows? I mean, I've said that like 20 times and it hasn't.
Yeah.
Um, but this time it really does feel like the war is coming to its closure. With the Trump administration coming in, because I see whatever deal the U.S. makes, it's going to be painted as like, oh, a Trump capitulation, and people are going to be attacking Trump from like the right, or from they're going to be like, oh, he capitulated to he lost the war. I think that will be the narrative from the media for whatever deal is made, and to compensate that, I could see Trump being like, oh, you think I'm soft? Well, look what I'm going to do to Iran. Like, I could see that type of situation coming back, and I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu is obviously the king of the United States, and he will be lobbying
Yeah.
for this, and everyone in the Trump administration is a devout Zionist.
Yeah.
Like, this Trump administration, you keep on saying it, like, man, like, how can an administration become more Zionist than the previous one? Well, this one is more Zionist than this is going to be the most Zionist administration ever.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know. I think Iran's going to get bombed either way. So will they go for the nuke, or will they not go for the nuke? It's gonna be a wild.
What's different about this time and the last Trump administration, when there was that like almost will he won't he, with that drone downing. Remember that episode? Um, the difference is that Iran was strong and had that, to Jose's point, that ring of fire in place, and a lot of like tripwire, where it would be painful to make any moves against Iran. But now it seems there's a lot of the positive points kind of going out the window. So Russia's got their hands tied with their Ukraine war, and Iran lost Syria, presumably, right? The war with Hezbollah, it's not won or lost, but it's not necessarily positive. It's probably been draining resources, and the U.S. continues to, bomb the shit out of random Houthi places whenever they act up in that Gulf. So it seems like, and also there's the reformist government options, and it just seems like they don't have a lot of cards to play anymore. So
Nope.
what feels different to me now for this new Trump administration is that he'd be less apt to say no. Like he might be like, all right, well, why not? He might be getting advice from people that says they're on the back foot. They don't have a lot of cards to play here. We can bully them into submission, or we just bomb the shit out of them. You know,
They still have cards to play.
what cards do you think they still have to play?
Their ballistic missile, their ballistic missile capability can reach pretty much anywhere in the Middle East, and there's
Anywhere in
really
the
no
Middle
way
East,
to
but
defend it.
Republicans don't care about the Middle East. You know,
I mean, they would care if it hit Saudi oil refineries. They would care if the Strait of Hormuz was shut down, because it would drive up the cost of oil to, extravagant amounts. There's still cards that they could play. I think
that's
that
a very generous assumption on some of the more hawkish right in the United States. I don't think they think that far ahead.
they probably don't, but like,
To be honest, I could see them do because I kind of agree more with Danny that they're just not thinking that far ahead. I could see honestly a revival of like an Operation Praying Mantis 2 where they attack where they attack like tankers. I mean, Lindsey Graham has said like that the US should be bombing Iranian oil rigs, cuz like one thing about the Zionist Republicans, they don't they're unhinged in how they don't care about the US working classes,
Yeah.
especially
that's an important factor. They don't care at all about anyone else besides the master.
And Trump is effectively like a term limited president too, like by default. So he doesn't have to answer to voters. That's like another thing that that makes it even more likely like some type of kinetic action. That said, I have said that the main thing that Trump is why he's receiving a lot of the patronage from Miriam Adelson and the like, and all this Zionist money. I just think that they're gonna what they're gonna get is like some like annexations in like Palestine with regards to the West Bank and Gaza. That's what they're most likely gonna get, and I think they may even further get some annexations like with like Syria to get that
maybe even southern Lebanon, depending on how that Hezbollah situation.
Yeah, and that's what I think they're trying to secure most. Iran is more like icing on the cake, but this is, in my opinion, one of like Iran's most like strategically vulnerable moments. I'm not saying like this is like the end of the regime, but I do think that there is a narrative, and I've seen it too on Israeli media like I-24 News English, hyper Zionist, and the consensus there is that they really are convinced that Iran is on the back foot and they're gonna do something. And I'd also add another thing too. One trick that I think the Trump administration may play, and I think it was something that came out in the first administration. They're gonna try to separate Russia from Iran. I think they may play around by offering the carrot of full-blown sanctions relief for Russia if they just basically leave Iran out to the wolves to fend for itself in terms of like military defense cooperation and all of that. Because I think that was like a strategy. It was like revealed that the Trump administration was using the kind of like the Abraham Accords framework and just like the building of the so-called Arab NATO in conjunction with some realpolitik with Russia to play ball with Russia, but then on the condition that Russia would abandon Iran, and then they would effectively have like the Arab NATO balancing coalition against Iran in conjunction with the maximum pressure to effectively not just contain it, but ultimately roll it back.
Yeah, I mean, what they could potentially do is that they, maybe they like give Russia basically the jurisdiction over like Latakia and Tartus provinces because that's where all the Alawites live too.
Yeah,
or most of them. So like maybe like they allow kind of an autonomous Alawite section where they're able to keep their base, and um, that will eliminate the contention they have with Israel. If it's just for like trading with Africa, going to Africa and stuff like that. I mean, that could be something, but here's the thing: this situation is going to be so hard to predict, man. Like there could be some really unforeseen consequences of this. It's like it's right now. I think that, as I said earlier, I think violence isn't going to be immediately is not going to break out. Like I don't think a civil war is going to break out like right now or tomorrow between different sects in Syria. But I don't know, like when the US does, like when do these situations ever work out? Like when we like when like when does one power funding one group to overthrow government, like how many times does that backfire? Like in Iraq, for example,
more times than it hasn't.
When we got rid of Saddam, and we basically handed the country to Iran with a silver platter. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
In the case of Afghanistan and funding the Mujahideen, look how that turned out. You don't know. I guess we're not entirely sure how these groups on the ground are going to, I guess, react to the Israelis potentially annexing parts of Syria. Right now, they're saying, yeah, we don't want to pick a fight with them. Just do what you want. But I mean, I kind of noticed there is a trend in the Middle East of secularization. Like people are becoming largely more like they're becoming less religious in the Middle East. I don't know if you've observed that as well, Jose.
Yes, I think in Iran that's becoming more common, and one of the more interesting things to watch out for. I think that you are and even like Saudi Arabia too, under MBS, you're seeing signs of this, that really the trend actually has been towards secularization in the Middle East. It especially up until the Cold War, but then the funding of all these like Wahhabis and like madrasas, and then the injection of a lot of US resources and aid to the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist networks artificially propped up weird strains of Islam. But the overarching trend in a lot of these countries is that people are moving away from these more austere sects of Islam. And I think one of the first countries to probably really move towards a more secular form of governance is probably going to be Iran. But I think that it does not necessarily mean they will be pro-Western. I think you may see, especially in light of recent mishaps by the Axis of Resistance, that Iran may make a more of a Persosphere pivot towards like lands of like that were under the dominion of like the previous Persian empires, like in Central Asia and whatnot, or basically a Eurasianist type of pivot, because that's kind of where things are heading towards anyways in the multipolar world, is that countries are looking more eastward more so.
Yeah. Well, definitely in Iran, but like you said earlier, like Saudi Arabia, like, MBS. I read something on MBS recently where he wasn't that religious in his personal life.
I mean, UAE is also really obvious, that one too.
Yeah, definitely UAE. But then there's so if you just like look at the climate 10 years ago, like 10 years ago, I remember watching like Al Jazeera, Al Jazeera, the one that's broadcasted, the version that's broadcasted in the Middle East is very different than the version that's broadcasted to the West.
Naturally,
Yeah.
Very
Al Jazeera
entirely
Plus.
different. So the Al Jazeera that was being broadcasted during like the Syrian civil war, they would have like fanatics on their panel who would be like, yeah, Shias deserve to die. You know, like they would have like these real fanatics who would be like calling for the death of the Shia on air. I don't think they do that anymore. I haven't tuned into Al Jazeera Arab as of late, but I think even across like Sunni sects, a lot of them have seen like how fucking miserable like a caliphate would potentially be.
Yes.
That they don't want really any part of it. And I think just globally people are becoming more secular. And I guess the point where I'm trying to get here is that there might be less contention between Sunnis and Shia. But I guess the argument against that is that in the Middle East, as we all probably know, Sunni and Shia, I mean, they're not arguing over the fucking lineage of Muhammad.
right.
At the end of the day,
It's
like,
a different kind of
political
argument.
terms. Like a
Yeah,
Sunni
exactly.
and a Shia are political terms in the Middle East rather
Right.
than truly religious. I mean, they are religious terms. I mean, ISIS used to go around and they kill people because they were apostates. You know,
Right.
The real reason is they're political groups, and
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more aligned with like the power structures rather than the religious structures.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but if there's like I guess if that dividing line decreases, there could be more cooperation between Sunnis and Shia. You even see it now with Saudi Arabia and Iran. There are diplomatic overtures. Like they both are obviously playing each other to some degree, but they are talking to each other. And that was kind of unheard of years ago where, the Saudis were.
Yes. This is, I think there's the X factor too. Chinese influence in the Middle East, I think is not really being talked about. That it's actually somewhat a force of stabilization because in the lead up to the normalization of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, China issued some interesting diplomatic statements backing up the UAE and Saudi Arabia, where they were like, it sounded almost like not neocon Zionists, where they were accusing Iran of causing destabilization through its proxies across the Middle East. And I think that's just part of a tactic to kind of get those two to the negotiating table to normalize relations. But one thing too, China has some in a weird way has some aligned interests with like the US and the Saudis with regards to the Houthi conflict, where China has backed the Yemeni central government before and is not big on territorial disintegration there, and they want those shipping lanes secured too. And I think with China exerting more influence in the Middle East, you are going to see just a much stabler geopolitical environment, in my opinion. Contrast that to the US or Israel, which basically rely on divide and rule. Let's be honest, the whole Oded Yinon plan, clean break, greater Israel, whatever you want to call it, plan, it's just predicated on engineering sectarian violence, creating failed states, and all of that to create Lebensraum for Israel, or at least an environment where there's no cohesive political entity to challenge Israeli hegemony, American Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. With the multipolar world, in theory, there's checks against that. And in fact, many of these same countries, like these Arab countries that are going to be part of the so-called Arab NATO that the Kushner crowd and the other weird Zionists that back Trump want to form, all these countries are aligned with China. They're very much economically aligned with it, and they have and China will exert economic and diplomatic pressure to say, hey, we don't want the Middle East to go up in flames because of some weird Zionist fixation of reenacting Old Testament fantasies in the Middle East. We want this area to be stable. So there's that factor as well.
I totally agree with you, Jose. I think what's interesting about what you're saying is that, you know, everyone needs money and everyone wants money.
Yes.
Everyone wants to
Yeah.
make money. And yes, you could get money from a bunch of different sources. You can align yourself with the US, you can align yourself with the Israelis, you can align yourself with, European, Union. But when you align yourself with China, they're very predatory. I'm not gonna be an apologist for China, right? Like the types of deals they set up are clearly set up in such a way so that they can take advantage of you. However, their money doesn't come with like this hidden agenda, right? Like their agenda is very clear. I want to make money. I want to set up this Belt and Road Initiative. I want to be a global economic powerhouse, and we want to take over the U.S. in terms of the economy. And it's very straightforward, right? Like they're not trying to destabilize the region so that some other country can gain space, i.e., the U.S. They're not funding random. Well, so far as I know, they're not like funding random terrorist groups or splinter cells or types of factions like that. They literally just want to set up businesses and economic stuff.
I'm trying to think, like, is there like a weird proxy that China backs that
I don't think so.
I can't think of one.
They did funny enough, they did back elements of the Mujahideen during the Soviet-Afghan war, but so long ago. Yeah, that was eons ago. But yeah, you know, if anything, this is where a lot of the overlap of with regards to like Iran, for example, Balochi separatism is a problem not only just for like Iran, but it's also for Pakistan. And there's actually a good deal of evidence that these separatist groups in especially in Pakistan, where there's a lot of Chinese economic activity, are directly attacking Chinese workers and Chinese economic assets. And there are some people who suggest that these separatist groups have like US backing. So China has very strong territorial integrity interests to ensure that its economic activity goes swimmingly, and that the countries that it's having a lot of economic intercourse with just don't go up in flames because the US or Israel or any of the US's satrapies just decide to get ideas to get slick on the geopolitical stage.
Mm-hmm. While we're on the topic of things that people don't talk too much about, we haven't really covered almost at all the Turkish element in this Syria situation, as well as the potential Kurdish element in this as well. What are your guys' takes on Turkey in this whole situation? And
I think it's a pretty dangerous game that they're playing right now. I mean, the reasons that they're stating for this is to settle the Kurdish question being one, and then to send the Syrian refugees packing home. But like, if this doesn't go well, then there's gonna be more Syrian refugees, if anything. If the country, I mean, because there's like there's a real chance that the country can go up in flames. So if that happens, there's going to be more refugees.
I think that's kind of counter to this so-called neo-Ottoman, agenda that supposedly Turkey is pursuing. They can't have their neighbors, on fire. So does that make them more likely to support HTS right now, or what do you think the deal is there? Maybe they do a deal with HTS to say, hey, let us go murder all those Kurds in the Northeast, and we'll let you guys do your thing, and we'll give you some money.
Well, that seems like it's coming, right? Like, isn't that the next step in this? That they're Kurds,
I feel like
that they're going to go to settle the Kurdish question. I mean, I haven't. Yeah, I'm no expert on the. I don't really follow Turkish politics that closely. Jose, do you have any insight on this?
Yeah, the Turkey. So one of the broad themes in the Middle East. This goes back to some of our talk about the Gulf Arab states. You're seeing more of a return of a development of nationalism, and even forms of petty nationalism and parochialism, as opposed to traditional imperialism or like pan Sunni or even pan Shiite type politics. I think you're seeing more of an ethno nationalist twist or petty nationalist twist where countries are going to try to defend more like ethnic integrity. And I think in the Turkish case, it kind of makes sense because the Kurds um do present a threat to the Turkish ethno nationalist project. If they get like some neo Ottoman benefits sprinkled in, that's kind of like the cherry on top for them. But they, I think, are going to be more focused on dealing with the Kurds, and then they can start talking about st- um getting more involved in like neo Ottoman ventures or even appealing to Sunnis in a broader sense because Erdogan has tried to fashion himself as a kind of emir, if you will, of the Middle East, and he's seen as like a strongman figure. And even in some respects, they do this Eurasianist pivot, this pan-Turkic pivot to be like the champion of all like Turkic peoples. But I think they're going to get the Kurdish situation sorted out first and foremost.
Yeah, because not just a couple weeks ago or month or so ago, it wasn't the Kurdish rebel group PKK doing that like deadly attack in Turkey recently. So that popped off just very recently. It's still pretty fresh, and I know that they were talking about a Turkey PKK detente, but that was before Syria fell.
Yeah, total game changer there. You might see the classic example of the Kurds getting played yet again by the West, getting propped up, and then
Yeah.
and it might be coming. That's kind of the story of the Kurds because if there's actually one thing that goes above sectarian divides that unites Turkey, and well, at least Syria when it was a coherent state, Iraq and Iran, is that they don't want a Kurdistan like forming for that's for sure.
Free Rojava.
Yeah, well, I've been reading stuff, and there's all sorts of speculations. One speculation I've heard, which I don't put too much water in, is that the Israelis are annexing territory in Syria to barter for a Kurdish state, and I'm like, I don't think that that's likely.
What's in it for
Yeah.
what's in it for Israel if they, to help the Kurds?
Israel trades with the Kurds. They get a lot of their oil from the Kurds.
Yeah. Also, I mean, well, Kurds, to be honest, like a lot of other separatist groups, in the Middle East, especially in Iran. I mean, this goes back to the Yunon plan. Israelis make it pretty clear that any kind of separatist group they'll try to prop up to weaken potential rivals, whether it's like Turkey, Iran, or whatever. Like that's what like they do like if they can't get like a obsequious like Gulf Arab monarchic state, they'll just want like a failed state, like a dysfunctional state. They'll settle for that as a way to maintain their security and hegemony in the region.
Hmm.
Another interesting theory I've heard was I saw this on in the Moon of Alabama threads.
Oh God, Moon of Alabama.
It wasn't even Bernard. It was someone. It was in the thread that Israel's annexing Syrian territory to make a place to throw all the Palestinians.
I've heard some Israelis actually talk about that on Twitter. I've seen some Israelis say that. Yeah.
Good luck moving them all.
Yeah. I mean best of luck.
Yeah, I mean that wouldn't be.
It's going to be a nightmare.
I'm sure that the new Syrian government would like that.
Really appreciate
right?
a bunch of disgruntled Hamas and all. See, this is the problem. I want to bring this back to why did this like new round of fighting end so quickly? Henry, you said this earlier. They were busing all of these people out and into Idlib, and that was like the staging ground. They were like, let's just put them all over there. And what ended up happening is like you ended up like consolidated their forces, right? Instead of keeping them separate and easy to pick off one at a time, you consolidated the strength. So this theory that we're just gonna grab all of these Palestinians and stick them in some Syrian, outpost annex, that's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. Like, set aside the humanitarian and like the ethical questions, right? That's just a terrible strategic idea, because now you're going to have a bunch of pissed off people who are just force evicted from what they believe is their land, and they were just subject to over years now bloody war, and all of the history behind that, and now they're not necessarily under the thumb of Israel anymore. Now that it's going to be much easier for them to get support from the outside. Terrible idea.
Those were the risks that Israel was. Those were the external threats that Israel was facing with Palestinian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Israelis invaded Lebanon.
That's right.
Because the PLO was operating there.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So you can get another situation like that. Like, you give them the ability to reconstitute, and then, they are Muslim. Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood group. It's
right.
That's the origin of it. So,
so let's stick them with the other Muslim Brotherhood people. That's not a good idea.
They could attract more people, and you're giving them the ability to reconstitute. I guess that would be from anywhere, because the other place that they were saying that they would,
the Sinai Peninsula
would be the Sinai, and
same
Egypt,
deal.
That's the same deal. The Muslim Brotherhood strongholds are Egypt and Syria, or two of the strongholds are Egypt and Syria.
Yeah.
There's obviously other ones as well, but
Israel's playing fire here too, because there's actually a lot of rumors that Egypt is not in a good economic state either, and that's
who is
yeah, and there's like a potential for something to like really pop off there. And if Turkey gets more powerful, and you see like states like Syria and Egypt weaken, and let's just draw this out like hypothetically in a post-Erdogan future, a really powerful Turkey in the Middle East coupled with Muslim Brotherhood friendly states like in Syria and Egypt, you've got a strategic nightmare for Israel. Like, every other decade, because of the Palestinian question and also just the amount of enemies Israel creates, their security situation, whenever it makes like a marginal improvement for like 5 years, it creates like a big fat problem for them in like the next 15 to 20 years in the long term. That's just the perpetual cycle they're in.
That's what I was trying to get at earlier, that these are unforeseen consequences. Like, Israel's getting what they want in the short term, and it's obvious that the Shia resistance is taking a pretty big blow, and it's like a huge question mark if they're going to be able to reconstitute and exist over the next several years. But I guess from the perspective, if I was an Israeli and I was like thinking in strategic terms about protecting the country long term, I kind of like that I'm next to a weak Assad, like a weak Syria, like a weak Assad, like, because they were bombing
with impunity, right?
Syria with impunity for years, and
like super close to Damascus,
never going to
too.
be able to threaten them again, like in '73, and invade them and take back the Golan Heights. Like, that was never going to happen. I feel like they're potentially replacing one enemy with another enemy in the future, and they're in a position where, like, the entire world hates them, especially the Muslim world. And Turkey obviously is, they play both sides. Like, Erdogan will condemn them, but like, meanwhile, he'll cooperate with them in secret. Eventually, man, that could change, man. Like in the Middle East, people there's these states, there's no like loyalty there, like they'll backstab you when the time is convenient, and they may be creating an enemy that's like way worse than what they're dealing with the Shia. Because
they
a good
could
point
be making
about
an
like,
ISIS 2.0, right? Like the last time.
I mean,
they
you have to
fought.
remember that the Israelis, you know, their whole history is like working with one side, and then that side becomes the enemy eventually. Like with Hamas, they
Yep.
used to,
They started it,
they
basically, yeah.
greenlit the story of Hamas is like that they were a Muslim Brotherhood charity in Israel, and like the Israelis like greenlit like their charity status and all that, and like they actually went as far as to use them to kind of like be a bulwark against the PLO, the secular kind of commie PLO. Like they would use them. There were like reports of them like having, there's like this big Wall Street Journal article that was written like in the 90s that just like goes over the whole history of how like they used to use them to like kind of rough up PLO guys and stuff. So they used to work with like the precursor. They weren't Hamas yet, but the precursors of Hamas. And I mean, look what they got now. Like that's their obviously their sworn enemy. And then even with Iran too. Like in the 80s, they had a good relation. Like when the United States was funding Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. I mean, the U.S. was funding both sides, but they were funding Iraq more. The Israelis were they had the back of Iran more.
Mm-hmm.
Like they were supporting Iran more than they were, and
Saddam was a bigger enemy.
They were conducting joint military operations against Iraq. So, I mean, there's a book by Trita Parsi called Treacherous Alliance, which like goes over the policy decisions in Israel to revert, to pivot their foreign policy to be anti-Iran. But they could be, they could be creating a pretty bad spot for them in the future, especially as the country itself is like facing a lot more internal problems than they were previously with their really, really odd political parties that are rising. And I don't know. I don't think it's I think they don't have the ability to think long term at this point. Like they just think in like fucking win, let's fucking win. Like they're always looking for that short term gain. Because they're so addicted to winning. But sometimes sometimes you can win yourself to death.
Yeah. I mean, another thing too is if like the US starts to lose hegemony on the world stage, that's like another big factor as well that could really screw things up for Israel as well. Because let's face it, a lot of Israel's existence is owed to the fact that it lives in a Western dominated order and has been able to thrive in a more Eurasianist order. Not so sure that they would get a blank check to do a lot of stuff they do, and especially with the new like demographics of like the Israeli population as it becomes more ironically, it's actually one of the places where it's actually becoming more religious and more fanatic over time. It's going to become a much less functional state altogether. Yeah, I mean, another thing too, what I think is probably going on in DC, one reason probably why there's some elements of restraint in DC is that any kind of really huge attack against Iran that results in regime change or causes some type of strife there. I mean, that's just basically asking for the Turks to get like hegemony in the Middle East. Like you just knock out like a big check in Iran. And frankly, all these Gulf Arab states, like in a way, even more so than Israel, they depend so much on a US led order that any kind of scenario of massive political instability or the US just having to retrench from the Middle East just does not augur well for them. And it leaves like the coherent civilization states like Iran and Turkey, for that matter, in a much stronger position. So that's why I think there is a natural tendency for restraint now in this more like multipolar order than was before. And that's probably an X factor that a lot of people need that should consider when trying to predict stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if cooler heads prevailed in Israel, man, they would have like taken when they had an 80-20 majority, they would have just taken that, man, and they would have been like, all right, this is good. But like, I mean, there was a lot of people in Israel who were warning them that they were going down the route that this was going to cause problems. But I mean, right now, it's tough to say because like we don't really know the casualties that they're facing in Gaza. Like I don't think I've seen like a number that I'm accounting for. I know they're still happening. It's not like this is still. It's not like it's over. Like they're still taking casualties. So it's hard. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell like what the like how if the military is demoralized or not or how demoralized they are. But I guess we'll see. But
honestly, that's the answer to this entire conversation. I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so unpredictable. There's so many people who like are like, oh, this is gonna happen, like just as I predicted, and I'm like, dude, this is like no one fucking knows what's gonna happen.
Uncharted
There's
waters.
so many variables that like no one is privy to, and like the Middle East is all kind of it's still dominated by like kind of tribal patron politics that. Like you can't people who study it their entire life don't totally understand it. So it's like with the Assad regime, like that they lasted as long as they did. I mean, they lasted 61 years. I mean, they lasted so long because of this like patron network they had set up. The patron network, essentially they couldn't. I think what you said earlier about them not being able to pay their soldiers is kind of like the primary thing. It's like, are you really, I don't care how much you love your country, but if you're making $10 a week, like how the fuck are you gonna, like, where's your motivation to fight?
Mm-hmm. Especially if somebody else on the other side, on the rebel side is making a hell of a lot more.
Yeah. So I guess when those things are, I forget the point I'm trying to make because I'm tired at this point. But when there's like rocks thrown in those things, shit can go wild.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll see. I mean, if I was like in school and I had time to write if I was writing a thesis, this would be an interesting thesis topic as to like how Syria unraveled and like what were all the geopolitical dealings between Russia, Turkey, and Iran, and the Gulf states, and Israel, and the United States. To be completely honest, I feel like the United States had like the least to do with this out of all the major powers.
Yes.
I don't think the U.S. is even capable. Like, I don't think our diplomatic corps is like competent enough to do this. I think they're so dumb. Like the people in charge in the State Department are really stupid that I don't even think they could pull this off. I think they'd want to take credit
Don't levy
for it.
your opinion on Blinken on the entire State Department. There's a lot of smart people there.
There's a lot of idiots. There's a lot of people just like Blinken who are just deer in the headlights, stupid, and like you're going to be getting more of them with the Trump administration.
Oh yeah, they're gonna make him look like Einstein level. To be honest, I mean, yes, that is actually a really good point you raised. This the Syria situation, some people like the simplistic level 1 analysis will be like, oh, devastating blow for illiberal countries like Iran and Russia. But I think a more next level analysis of this shows that this could be a victory for like a post Western liberal order where the fate of Syria was ultimately determined by big players in the Middle East and Russia and not so much the West. That could be like what is seen like where now the political crises that take place in the Eurasian plain they're being more sorted out by Eurasian actors, not Western actors any longer, which points to a sign that the West's influence is gradually diminishing in the region. It is somewhat of a silver lining for those who believe in multipolarity and want to end the Western liberal hegemonic order.
Yeah, this just happened to be in the U.S.'s ultimate policy goal, but yeah, I don't. I guess time will tell, but I don't think it. I think this was primarily spearhead. Like this was primarily like a Turkish Russian Gulf state project, and to some degree Iran, because I think they had to iron out. I think Iran got some guarantees, but I mean, who knows? Who knows? And I think Russia probably got some guarantees. I mean, how fast did it take for the Russians to fucking change their embassy flag in Syria? They did it like the day of. They changed it to the black and red to the green and red flag. I mean, I don't know. We'll see what happens with that base, man. Like that's going to be like a big question, like the big thing to watch. Like, will they stay?
I think they get their hands tied. I don't know how they're going to hold on to it militarily. If somebody wanted it.
Well, I mean, it's not a matter of them not being able to defend it. It's a matter of like, will they work with the new government of Syria? Because again, like
They're gonna have to
foreign
if they wanna
policy,
keep
a
it.
foreign policy is like, I mean, a state's foreign policy is a state's foreign policy. In a lot of cases, like it won't just change with like like with a new regime. Even if there is a new regime, like still, the people who ran Assad's foreign policy are still they're still in their diplomatic corps. They haven't been
Right.
replaced yet.
Right, exactly. The current prime minister is working with the HTS guys to set up the transitional government.
So it's not like there's been this complete turnover where like everyone in the Ba'ath regime is gone now. There's still like I think the UN, the guy who represents Syria in the UN is still there. So it's not. I mean, maybe they were going to be phased out, but it's not like they're in the middle of Damascus being hung.
Right
Now,
exactly. Yeah.
which
Which
is
is
what you
why
would
I think this
expect.
is different, which is why my initial reaction to this was like, this might actually hold.
We'll see. We'll see. I think there's going to be a lot of like external, like again, like I think there's going to be a lot of effort to keep this from turning into a violent war from not the United States, but from
Everyone else.
from everyone else around. So they might be. I hope I hope there's not a civil war, a war that breaks out, but it could definitely happen.
I'm getting some retro futuristic vibes in a way from this. This seems like a kind of like concert of Europe type of deal where you're seeing like these countries like from like Russia, Iran, Turkey starting to pack together like the way the international order post Napoleon um operated in Europe, where you're seeing like whenever a conflict pops off, there's like immediate mediation by these institutions, and they try to make sure that these political transitions happen smoothly during like upheavals and certain insurrections, as opposed to like the way the US has done things in the last century of just destabilizing as much as possible and creating as much chaos as much as possible.
I mean, in the case of Ukraine, man, like wasn't pretty much everyone flipped out who was part of the Yukounovich government? I think
Yeah.
so. I think so. Like pretty much everyone. I know the finance minister was the.
Yeah.
So in a lot of like in Iraq, they had a process, a de-Baathification process, where they purged all the government workers in the Ba'ath Party. So they're not doing that in Syria. So like, you know, there's still going to be like kind of interest from the old regime there. But I mean, again, who knows, man? It's the Middle East. It's a wild place.
Yes,
So things
indeed.
can fucking, you know, some fucking crazy group can go into an Alawite neighborhood and kill 100 people. That's possible. Hopefully it doesn't, but that's definitely like, you know, within the realm of like maybe medium likelihood, enough to make you really uneasy about it. So I guess again, we'll see. We've been on for an hour and 40 minutes, so I don't want to take up your entire evening, Jose. We really do appreciate you taking time to speak with us. Should we end this right here?
Sounds like a good plan.
All right. Thanks everyone for, well, first, Jose, plug all your stuff, your Substack, your podcast, where everyone can find your work.
Yeah, you can find my podcast, El Niño Speaks, on my Substack, josbcf.substack.com. Also, it's on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble as well. You can find that. I'm focusing more on writing at the moment, and that's going to be also found on my Substack, Jose Niño Unfiltered.
We'll make sure to drop a
Awesome.
link to that in the notes there.
Yeah, check out all of Jose's work. I'm a member of his Substack, which I do enjoy. And then Jose and I periodically we do a podcast on Jose's Substack called America Second, where we just talk about the absurdity of mostly U.S. foreign policy, but and U.S. domestic politics as well. So if you want to listen to that, go to Jose's page and make sure you support him. Is there anything? Oh yeah, we have a Substack too, which has been growing pretty nice. I thought it was going to be take longer to get 100 subscribers, but we did. So go to our Substack where we also release articles. You get ad-free episodes if you join our Substack, and then you also get early releases episodes. And we put out articles. I think I said that. For some of our more historical stuff, we put out maps and shit like that. So go there. It will support us greatly. And then the chat that we used to have, we have a chat there that we're going to build out like how we used to have our old Slack, which was very vibrant. And then we ran out of memory and it kind of died. But that won't run out of memory. So go to the Bro History Slack, excuse me, I'm pitching the wrong thing, Substack chat where we can all talk. Okay. Anything else, Danny?
Yeah, one last thing. I just realized that you could chat with us on Spotify. Apparently, it allows comments, and I hadn't noticed that some of y'all were already doing that. So Spotify did their yearly Wrapped, and I looked at some really awesome stats, and apparently thousands of you guys are listening to Bro History more than any other podcast. So we really appreciate that growth. That's been awesome. Go ahead and start talking to us there. I'm going to make a really good effort to respond to them now that we have some good integrations with our podcast host provider. So that's another place in addition to our YouTube where you can, and our Substack, of course, where you can engage with us. So if you found this conversation interesting, if you think we got something wrong, if you think we fucking suck, I don't care. Engage with us. Leave us a little comment. I'd love to see that, and I'd love to respond to them.
All right. If you think we suck, just keep it to yourself, honestly. But if you like us, then that's great, too. I don't respond to any comments.
It's mostly me.
Danny. That's FYI. All right. Peace, guys.
See ya.